Tonight, we step softly into the ancient world, where the lamps burn low, the marble streets grow quiet, and a thoughtful young boy begins a life that will one day carry the weight of an empire. As we journey back through the centuries, you can allow your own surroundings to fade into the background. There is no rush here, and no destination you need to reach. You can simply listen as the story unfolds, and if you find yourself drifting off before the tale is complete, that is perfectly fine. The ancient city will continue to rest quietly beneath the stars, holding its history in the stones, keeping watch while you sleep. Let your breathing slow, and let the gentle rhythm of a distant time carry you away from the demands of your day. Picture the evening settling over Rome, smoothing away the sharp edges of the afternoon heat and replacing the busy noise of the forums with a deep, settling calm. The sky gradually deepens from twilight into a soft, velvety indigo, and one by one, small flames begin to flicker in the windows of the villas scattered across the hills. Down in the quiet courtyards, the cool evening air carries the faint, sweet scent of cedarwood and blooming jasmine, while the steady, rhythmic murmuring of distant water flows from the stone fountains, endlessly pouring and endlessly calming. You can almost hear the soft whisper of leather sandals moving slowly across the smooth, cool marble floors as the residents of the city retreat into their private sanctuaries, leaving the restless affairs of the empire resting in the quiet shadows. Heavy wooden doors are drawn softly shut, and thick linen tapestries are pulled gently across the windows to keep out the night chill, as the ancient world breathes a long, slow sigh of relief as the day finally comes to an end. The scrolls are rolled away, the ink is left to dry, and the mind is allowed to finally rest. It is in this quiet, softly illuminated world that we find the beginning of our story, not in the bright, unforgiving light of the public arenas or the crowded Senate floors, but in the peaceful seclusion of a sleeping household. In the quietest rooms of these grand estates, we find the legacy of a man who would slowly grow to become a ruler, a thoughtful philosopher, a devoted husband, a caring father, and a reluctant soldier. He was a man who eventually held the absolute highest authority in the known world, commanding vast legions and ruling over millions of people. Yet he remained, at his very core, a deeply private individual who sought nothing more than the quiet governance of his own mind. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and he is remembered today not for the territories he conquered or the wealth he accumulated, but for the private thoughts he wrote down by the trembling light of an oil lamp, seeking only his own peace. He did not write for fame, nor did he write for an audience of admirers or future historians. He wrote simply to steady himself, to remind his own heart to remain gentle, patient, and resilient in the face of an unpredictable world. He wrote as the campfires burned low outside his tent, finding a quiet refuge in the simple act of putting words onto parchment. He was an emperor wrapped in the heavy purple wool of absolute power, yet beneath those heavy robes, he was simply a human being, wrestling with the same delicate frailties, the same fleeting sorrows, and the same quiet hopes that we all hold within ourselves as we wait for sleep to arrive. The story of his life is not a restless tale of dramatic conquest or sweeping military victories. Instead, it is a slow and thoughtful journey through the quiet seasons of a life lived with careful intention. It is a story of heavy duties accepted with a calm and level gaze, of quiet reflection found in the lonely corners of grand palaces and the freezing edges of distant frontiers. It is a gentle exploration of personal discipline, where the inevitable losses of life are met not with despair, but with a softening acceptance of the natural order of all things. We will see him not as a statue carved in cold stone, but as a living, breathing person who felt the weight of the world and chose to respond with kindness. As we follow his footsteps through the marble hallways of his youth, through the quiet warmth of his family life, and eventually out into the misty, snow-covered landscapes of his final years, we will discover a life anchored by a profound and enduring inner calm. We will watch a thoughtful boy grow slowly into a wise and careful man, carrying the burdens of an empire as gracefully as one might carry a lantern through the dark, guiding us all toward a place of lasting and undisturbed rest. Our story of this thoughtful life begins in the warm, golden light of a Roman spring, in the year 121, when a boy named Marcus Annius Verus was born into a world of deep tradition and quiet privilege. He arrived in a sprawling, peaceful estate on the Caelian Hill, one of the greenest and most serene neighborhoods in Rome, where the air was scented with pine and the sounds of the bustling city below were softened into a gentle, distant hum. His family was woven into the very ancient fabric of the empire itself, possessing not just vast wealth, but a long, respected history of public service that stretched back across the generations. His grandfather had been a consul, moving through the highest offices of the government with a steady, quiet dignity, and his mother came from a family whose estates produced the very bricks that built the grandest temples and calmest courtyards of the capital. Yet inside the thick walls of their family home, the noise of politics and the heavy demands of aristocratic life were gently kept at bay, creating a peaceful sanctuary where a young mind could begin to slowly unfold. The days in this grand household moved with a calm, reassuring rhythm, shaped by the slow passage of the sun across the open atriums and the quiet rituals of domestic life. Picture the cool, shaded courtyards, where the morning light gently illuminated smooth marble statues of respected ancestors, their faces worn soft by the passage of time and the touch of many hands. As the mornings warmed into afternoons, the quiet splashing of fresh water in the central pools provided a continuous, soothing background melody to the household's activities, masking the distant sounds of chariots in the valley below. Servants moved softly along the colonnades, sweeping the mosaic floors and arranging fresh flowers, while the heavy wooden doors kept the relentless pace of the outside world firmly at a distance. It was a world of order and careful balance, where everything had its proper place and time, teaching the young boy early on the deep, settling comfort that comes from a life lived with gentle discipline, deep respect, and calm routine. When Marcus was only 3 years old, this peaceful childhood experienced its first quiet encounter with sorrow, as his father passed away. For a small boy, the loss of a father is a profound absence, an empty space where a guiding hand should have been. But in the Roman way, this grief was not allowed to turn into chaos or despair. Instead, the family closed around him like a protective cloak, offering a warm and stable embrace, and the memory of his father was preserved in the quiet dignity of the household shrines, honored softly with small offerings of wine and incense as the seasons turned. This early absence seemed to weave a thread of quiet seriousness into Marcus's character, encouraging him to look inward and to observe the world with a careful, thoughtful sensitivity that most children never need to develop. The loss was absorbed into the slow, steady current of his life, leaving behind not a sharp, unhealed wound, but a gentle awareness of how fragile and fleeting human life can be. A quiet lesson that would slowly blossom into the profound empathy he would carry for the rest of his days. In the gentle wake of this passing, Marcus was guided by the steady, protective presence of his grandfather, a man of immense integrity who became the boy's first and most enduring teacher. Under his watchful, caring eye, Marcus was raised not to revel in his wealth, but to understand the quiet responsibilities that such privilege required, learning that a life of service held more value than empty luxury. His education was a carefully structured journey through the classical world, led by soft-spoken tutors who taught him the graceful rhythms of Greek and Latin poetry, the steady logic of mathematics, and the vast, starry movements of astronomy. The boy spent countless hours in still, sunlit libraries, surrounded by the comforting smell of old parchment and the soft scratching of reeds on wax tablets, absorbing the wisdom of past generations while the afternoon shadows slowly lengthened across the floor. His teachers noticed that he possessed an unusual calm, a natural inclination to listen rather than to speak, and a remarkable patience for a child of his age. As he moved quietly from the shaded gardens of his youth into the widening corridors of his education, the foundation of a philosopher was being slowly and carefully laid, stone by stone, in the fertile soil of a peaceful mind. As Marcus grew from a quiet child into a thoughtful young man, the vast wealth of his family surrounded him like a heavy, golden cloak. Yet he found himself increasingly drawn to the simple and the unadorned. While other boys of his noble station were beginning to anticipate the grand feasts, the thrilling chariot races, and the endless political maneuvering of the capital, Marcus was quietly pulling away from the bright lights of aristocratic expectation. He preferred the quiet corner of a sunlit courtyard to the crowded halls of the elite, and he began to adopt habits that puzzled those who looked upon him with conventional ambition. He chose to wear a simple, rough wool cloak instead of the fine imported silks that his birthright allowed, and he asked to sleep on a hard wooden bed rather than sinking into soft, feathered cushions, finding a strange and settling comfort in the intentional practice of physical simplicity. This was not a restless rebellion, but a gentle turning inward, a slow realization that the gleaming surfaces of Roman luxury offered nothing to quiet the deeper questions that were already beginning to stir within his calm and steady mind. His education was an expansive and carefully tended garden, guided by the most respected minds in the empire, who recognized in him a rare and wonderful seriousness. Picture the quiet morning lessons, where the air was thick with the comforting scent of old parchment and the faint dry smell of chalk dust settling onto polished wooden tables. In the hushed stillness of the great libraries, the slow, rhythmic scratching of an iron stylus against smooth wax tablets became the soothing soundtrack of his youth. He studied the intricate, flowing cadences of Greek and Latin rhetoric, the precise and unyielding logic of mathematics, and the slow, majestic movements of the stars as they wheeled across the night sky. His teachers, many of whom would later be remembered by Marcus with deep and lasting gratitude, taught him not just the mechanics of law or the rules of grammar, but the much harder discipline of thinking clearly, speaking truthfully, and listening with a patient, open heart. As the hours drifted by and the afternoon light shifted slowly across the mosaic floors, the boy sat quietly, absorbing the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, like a dry earth receiving a gentle, steady rain. It was during these quiet years of study that Marcus encountered the profound and calming waters of philosophy, a discovery that would gently but firmly anchor his entire life. Among the many schools of thought that flowed through the bustling streets of Rome, it was the steady, unadorned teachings of Stoicism that captured his young imagination and resonated deeply within his quiet spirit. The Stoic masters taught that true happiness could never be found in the shifting sands of wealth, fame, or external comfort, but only in the quiet cultivation of one's own character. They believed that while we can never control the unpredictable storms of the world around us, we can always control how we choose to respond, finding our strength in the steady virtues of wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. For a boy who was being slowly prepared for a life of unimaginable power, these teachings offered a profound and necessary refuge, a quiet space within his own mind where he could build an inner fortress that no political crisis or personal tragedy could ever tear down. As he internalized these gentle but demanding lessons, Marcus continued to refine his own nature, quietly transforming the privilege of his birth into a deep and unwavering sense of moral duty. He learned to look past the dazzling illusions of Roman society, understanding that true nobility is not inherited through a powerful bloodline, but forged slowly and carefully through a lifetime of honest and virtuous choices. He became a young man who listened more than he spoke, who considered his actions with a slow and measured care, and who treated the servants in his household with the same gentle respect that he offered to the highest senators of the realm. The thoughtful boy was slowly growing into himself, unaware that his quiet integrity was already drawing the gaze of the most powerful men in the empire, and that the peaceful, modest life he so deeply desired was soon to be entirely reshaped by the heavy, unavoidable hand of destiny. Yet for now, he simply remained in the quiet library, reading by the soft light of a solitary lamp, building the quiet strength he would one day need to carry the weight of the entire world. In the quiet rhythm of his daily studies, surrounded by the soft scent of old parchment and the steady, reassuring presence of his tutors, Marcus was entirely content to let the loud and restless world of political power pass him by. He desired nothing more than the peaceful pursuit of wisdom. Yet, the wider world had already begun to quietly observe him from a distance. The emperor at the time was Hadrian, a man of vast and practical experience who had spent his long life traveling the immense expanse of the Roman territories, building enduring stone walls, cool marble temples, and shaping the very laws of the land. As Hadrian gradually grew older and felt the inevitable slowing of his own steps, his thoughts naturally turned toward the distant future of the empire, seeking a steady, reliable hand to guide the millions of people who lived beneath the wide Roman sky. His watchful, assessing eyes eventually fell upon the young Marcus, who was then just 15 years old. What the aging emperor saw was not a boy hungry for influence or eager to command, but someone who possessed a rare, grounding stillness and an incredibly deep moral core. In a bustling imperial court where personal ambition often burned brightly and noisily, Marcus stood out like a quiet, enduring flame, carrying himself with a gentle seriousness that seemed entirely untainted by the dazzling wealth and privilege that surrounded him. Knowing that the peaceful continuation of the empire depended on careful, deliberate planning, Hadrian set into motion a quiet and elegant arrangement that would forever alter the gentle course of Marcus's life. He did not simply place the heavy crown directly upon the head of a teenager, understanding that the immense weight of the world must be lowered gently and gradually onto a new generation. Instead, he chose a highly respected and deeply responsible senator named Antoninus Pius to be his immediate successor. Hadrian adopted the older man as his own son in a solemn, quiet ceremony, marked by the wearing of heavy linen robes, the soft murmuring of ancient oaths, and the pressing of heavy imperial seals into warm, softening wax. But this historic adoption came with a gentle, non-negotiable condition, a careful weaving of generations designed to ensure a long and unbroken season of peace. Antoninus, in turn, was required to officially adopt the young Marcus, along with another boy named Lucius Verus, binding them all together into a new, closely knit family. This was a family chosen not by the accidental ties of blood, but by a shared, quiet devotion to the enduring stability and profound responsibility of protecting the Roman world. Imagine the day when this profound shift took place, not with the deafening roar of public crowds or the harsh clash of military swords, marble-lined chambers of the imperial residence, where the afternoon sunlight caught the dust, dancing slowly in the quiet, settled air. At the tender age of 17, Marcus found himself formally and permanently drawn into the very center of the empire, stepping softly from the private, shaded sanctuaries of his youth into the widening, brightly lit corridors of public duty. The transition required him to let go of the quiet, secluded life he had so deeply cherished, pulling him gently away from the comforting solitude of his personal libraries and the uninterrupted hours of philosophical study. It also meant quietly accepting the end of a previous romantic engagement, as the complex interwoven threads of imperial succession required him to marry Antoninus's daughter, Faustina, cementing the practical bonds of his new family. Yet, Marcus met these immense, life-altering changes not with restless resentment or fearful hesitation, but with the calm, yielding grace that his years of philosophical training had slowly and carefully cultivated within his mind. He understood, with a quiet wisdom that extended far beyond his young years, that we cannot always choose the circumstances that arrive at our doors, but we can always choose to invite them in and face them with a steady, virtuous, and patient heart. The heavy gold-embroidered cloak of his new position was placed carefully upon his shoulders, and he accepted its tremendous weight with the exact same quiet dignity he brought to his morning studies. From this crucial moment forward, his education subtly shifted its gentle course, turning slowly from the abstract contemplation of the distant stars to the practical, daily realities of governing a vast and complex world. The thoughtful boy who had once hoped only to master his own quiet mind was now being carefully prepared to guide the lives of millions, slowly learning how to weave the demanding threads of justice, necessity, and human compassion into the massive, unfolding tapestry of the Roman state. And as the long afternoon shadows stretched slowly across the polished floors of his new life, Marcus simply bowed his head, picked up his stylus, and continued to learn, allowing destiny to lead him softly by the hand into a future he had never sought, but was entirely prepared to meet. Under the steady and protective guidance of his new adoptive father, the young Marcus stepped softly into a long season of life characterized by deep stability and quiet preparation. The Emperor Antoninus Pius was a man who possessed a remarkable inner stillness, and he brought to the sprawling imperial court a sense of comforting order and deeply rhythmic routine. While previous rulers might have sought the dazzling light of public adoration or the loud, chaotic thrill of military conquest, Antoninus preferred the quiet, shaded corners of administration. He chose to govern the vast Roman world with the careful, measured patience of a devoted gardener tending to a fragile and complex landscape. For the next 23 years, Marcus would live, learn, and slowly mature in the peaceful shadow of this gentle man, observing day by day how true authority did not need to raise its voice to be heard, and how absolute power could be held firmly without ever corrupting the quiet soul of the one who held it. The daily life within the House of Antoninus moved with a reassuring predictability, deliberately kept far removed from the restless intrigue and sudden anxieties that so often plagued the centers of worldly power. Picture the wide, airy corridors of the imperial residence as the early morning light filtered softly through the towering colonnades, casting long, elegant shadows across the smooth, polished marble floors. There was no rushed urgency in this household, no sudden alarms or frantic footsteps echoing in the halls. Instead, the days unfolded with a calm and deliberate grace, moving to the slow, steady heartbeat of a well-ordered life. Marcus would often walk quietly beside the older emperor as they made their way toward the sunlit chambers of the Senate, the morning air scented with a faint, sweet trace of burning myrrh, and the dry, comforting smell of rolled parchment carried by their soft-spoken attendants. In these vast, echoing halls, Marcus learned the profound and necessary art of simply listening. He sat in quiet, patient observation as Antoninus carefully navigated the complex webs of Roman politics, treating every senator, every distant foreign ambassador, and every exhausted provincial governor with the exact same level of composed, unhurried respect. As the years drifted slowly and peacefully by, Marcus's apprenticeship gently deepened, expanding seamlessly from passive observation into active, thoughtful participation. He willingly took on the traditional roles of public service, working his way softly through the demanding duties of the Roman government, gradually learning the intricate, unseen machinery that kept the sprawling empire functioning. He spent long, quiet hours studying how the distant, dusty roads were maintained, wooden grain ships were guided safely into the calm harbors, and how the complex laws of the land were carefully interpreted and applied to protect the lives of ordinary citizens. But perhaps the most profound lesson he absorbed during these quiet, highly structured years was the delicate and often heavy art of human judgment. He watched Antoninus make measured decisions that would eventually ripple outward to affect the lives of millions, slowly realizing that a careful ruler rarely has the luxury of perfect, unbroken choices. He saw how even the most thoughtful and well-intentioned decisions could carry unintended burdens, and how governing a vast, unpredictable world required a deep, softening humility. Through this slow and steady immersion into the daily realities of leadership, the abstract philosophical ideals of Marcus's youth were gently tempered and refined by the practical, human demands of the present moment. He learned to gracefully accept the inevitable limits of his own control, understanding that while he could never hope to dictate the unpredictable winds of fortune or the varied behaviors of distant men, he could always command the absolute stillness of his own response. The imperial palace, with its heavy wooden doors, its thick tapestries, and its quiet, enclosed courtyard gardens, became a true sanctuary of learning. It was a peaceful space where the young man was allowed to grow steadily without the harsh, immediate pressure of supreme command. As the long afternoons would gradually soften into dusk, and the golden, fading light of the Roman sunset bathed the stone courtyards in a warm, sleepy glow, Marcus would often retreat to the comfortable silence of his private rooms, his mind comfortably full of the day's quiet observations. In the deepening twilight, surrounded by his books and his thoughts, he found a profound and lasting comfort in the knowledge that he was never alone in his duties. He slept peacefully through those long, secure nights, the heavy burdens of his future still kept safely at a distance by the protective care of his adoptive father. The vast empire rested securely in capable hands, and Marcus, too, was allowed to simply rest, slowly gathering the quiet strength that he would one day be called upon to share with the world. As the quiet years of his apprenticeship unfolded within the sheltered walls of the imperial palace, Marcus experienced another profound transition, one that would anchor his heart just as firmly as philosophy had anchored his mind. His marriage to Faustina, the daughter of the Emperor Antoninus, had initially been arranged as a matter of state, a careful political weaving designed to ensure the peaceful continuation of the empire. Yet, in the quiet private rooms of their shared life, far away from the heavy demands of public ceremony and the watchful eyes of the Senate, this arranged union slowly blossomed into a deeply rooted and genuine partnership. Faustina proved to be a companion who understood the unique and isolating pressures that accompanied his position, offering him a steady, comforting presence amidst the sprawling responsibilities of the Roman court. Their correspondence, preserved softly through the ages, reveals a relationship built on warm affection and a quiet mutual respect, creating a peaceful sanctuary within the very center of the most powerful household on earth. In the gentle evening hours, when the official business of the day was finally set aside, Marcus found a lasting comfort in the simple, unadorned reality of a loving home, where the emperor-in-waiting was allowed to simply be a husband. This quiet domestic sanctuary grew even warmer and infinitely more complex with the arrival of their children. Over the passing years, the wide, echoing halls of the imperial residence were gradually filled with the soft, lively sounds of childhood, as Faustina gave birth to 13 children over the course of their marriage. For Marcus, the experience of fatherhood was a profound awakening, introducing him to both the greatest joys and the deepest, most tender vulnerabilities of the human condition. Picture the thoughtful young man who had spent his youth contemplating the distant stars and the abstract principles of virtue, now sitting quietly in the fading afternoon light, holding a sleeping infant against his chest. The heavy intellectual concepts of his early education were suddenly grounded in the warm, breathing reality of a child's fragile existence. He watched his children grow and play in the sunlit courtyard gardens, their laughter drifting like music over the smooth marble statues, and he felt the overwhelming protective love that every parent knows, slowly softening the edges of his serious nature and deepening his understanding of the delicate balance of life. The quiet philosopher was learning that to truly understand the world, one must be fully and deeply connected to the people who inhabit it. But this deep fatherly love also brought him face to face with the painful reality of human fragility. Even the absolute highest reaches of wealth and imperial power could not protect a family from the silent, unpredictable arrival of illness, and Marcus and Faustina endured the quiet, devastating sorrow of losing several of their children at a very young age. These heartbreaking losses tested the very foundation of his philosophical beliefs. Yet he did not allow his grief to harden into bitterness or angry despair. Instead, the profound sorrow of losing his children slowly transformed his understanding of the Stoic teachings, moving his philosophy from the cool logic of the mind into the warm, aching center of the heart. He learned with a quiet and resilient grace to cherish the fleeting beauty of each moment, understanding that everything we love is merely loaned to us by nature. When he wrote about the impermanence of the world, he was not simply reciting dusty academic theories, but expressing the deep, lived wisdom of a father who had learned to love entirely, while holding the things of this world with a gentle, open hand. While his inner life was being quietly deepened by the joys and sorrows of his growing family, his public life was also undergoing a slow, imperceptible shift. As the Emperor Antoninus gradually grew older, His steps becoming slower and his energy naturally waning, he began to gently transfer the massive weight of the empire onto the capable, steady shoulders of his adopted son. Marcus took on these increasing responsibilities with a calm, uncomplaining dedication, handling the complex matters of military planning, distant diplomatic negotiations, and the endless stream of legal disputes with the same careful, measured patience he applied to his personal studies. There was no sudden, dramatic transfer of power, no ambitious grasping for authority, but rather a seamless, quiet blending of duties, like the slow turning of the seasons. The people of Rome hardly noticed the transition happening, as the administration continued its steady rhythm without interruption. By the time Antoninus approached his final days, Marcus was already guiding the vast machinery of the Roman state, sitting quietly at his desk late into the night, the soft yellow light of his oil lamp illuminating the heavy stacks of parchment before him. The world outside his window continued to rest peacefully beneath the moon, entirely unaware that the gentle changing of the guard had already taken place, securing the future of the empire in the careful, steady hands of a philosopher. As the years of his apprenticeship quietly extended and the heavy responsibilities of the empire slowly settled onto his shoulders, Marcus found his most profound refuge not in the vast palaces or the beautiful gardens of Rome, but in the quiet, secluded spaces of his own mind. When the long, demanding days of administrative duties finally came to an end, and the bustling imperial court fell softly into the hushed stillness of the night, he would retreat to his private rooms. Picture him sitting alone at a simple wooden desk, the only light coming from the warm, flickering glow of a small oil lamp casting gentle, dancing shadows across the walls. The air in the room was cool and still, carrying only the faint, familiar scent of dry parchment and melting wax. While the rest of the city slept peacefully beneath the vast, starry sky, Marcus would open his scrolls and immerse himself in the deeply comforting waters of Stoic philosophy. This was not a restless academic pursuit, but a gentle, necessary unwinding, a way to wash away the noise and the friction of the day, allowing his spirit to return to a place of natural, undisturbed calm. During these quiet, reflective hours, he was guided by the steady voices of his most trusted teachers, men who helped shape not just his intellect, but the very foundation of his character. Among them was the respected philosopher Junius Rusticus, a man of profound integrity who gently steered Marcus away from the empty, decorative language of traditional rhetoric, encouraging him instead to seek the plain, unadorned truth in all things. It was Rusticus who first placed into Marcus's hands the writings of Epictetus, a former slave who had become one of the greatest Stoic teachers of the ancient world. Reading the words of Epictetus by the soft yellow light of his lamp, the future emperor felt a deep, resonating connection across the vast divides of Roman society. Here was a philosophy that stripped away the dazzling illusions of wealth and supreme power, teaching simply that our true freedom lies not in what we can command in the outside world, but in how completely we can master our own inner responses. Epictetus taught him that we cannot control the unpredictable actions of others, the unexpected arrival of illness, or the changing winds of fortune, but we can always, without fail, control the steady, gentle grace with which we choose to meet them. Marcus absorbed these teachings slowly and deliberately, allowing them to seep deeply into the soil of his daily life, transforming abstract philosophical concepts into a continuous, living practice. He began to understand that true philosophy was not something to be debated loudly in the marble halls of the academy, but something to be practiced softly in the quiet, unseen moments of ordinary life. It was the practice of pausing before speaking in anger, the discipline of treating a difficult senator with patient, unwavering respect, and the quiet acceptance of duties that he might have preferred to avoid. There were times, of course, when the young man still wrestled with the deep, quiet tension between his natural desire for a peaceful life of solitary contemplation and the overwhelming, inescapable demands of active public service. He longed for the quiet of the country estates, the uninterrupted hours of study, yet he knew with a calm, settling certainty that his destiny lay in the crowded, complicated center of the empire. Through his slow, patient study, he gently reconciled these two worlds, realizing that the truest wisdom is found not in running away from the world, but in participating in it fully, while keeping one's heart entirely uncorrupted by its endless noise. It was during these peaceful, solitary nights that Marcus began the quiet habit of writing to himself, a practice that would eventually blossom into the profound collection of thoughts we now know as the Meditations. He did not write with the intention of instructing others, nor did he imagine that his private words would ever be read by anyone else. He simply wrote to soothe his own mind, using the slow rhythmic motion of his stylus to anchor his wandering thoughts and to gently remind himself of the virtues he so deeply wished to embody. As the ink dried on the parchment, he recorded small, quiet reminders to be patient with the flaws of human nature, to accept the fleeting, temporary nature of all things, and to meet each new morning with a kind and open heart. He wrote of duty, of humility, and of the profound, leveling reality of mortality, finding a strange, beautiful comfort in the knowledge that all human triumphs and sorrows are merely passing shadows in the vast, peaceful expanse of time. And as the oil lamp burned low, and the quiet night slowly gave way to the soft, gray light of the approaching dawn, the philosopher in waiting would finally set down his pen, close his eyes, and allow himself to drift into a deep, restful sleep, his mind perfectly clear and his heart entirely at peace. In the steady and unhurried passage of time, the year 161 arrived, bringing with it the quiet, inevitable end of an era. The Emperor Antoninus Pius, who had guided the Roman world with a gentle and steady hand for more than 2 decades, was softly nearing the conclusion of his long and deeply devoted life. There was no sudden chaos or frightened unrest within the palace walls, but rather a solemn, respectful hush that settled over the grand marble corridors like a soft blanket of snow. In his private, dimly lit chambers, surrounded by the heavy linen curtains and the faint, sweet scent of burning incense, the old emperor slipped away as peacefully as a candle burning down to its very end. His final thoughts and whispered words were not of his own passing, but of the empire he had loved so deeply, a final, quiet testament to a life lived entirely for the care of others. The transition of supreme power, which had so often in Roman history been marked by loud conflict and restless ambition, occurred here with nothing more than lowered voices and the respectful closing of a heavy wooden door. When the soft gray light of the next morning slowly began to filter through the tall windows of the imperial residence, Marcus Aurelius awoke not just as a man, but as the absolute ruler of the known world. At 39 years old, the long season of his patient apprenticeship was finally complete, and the immense, unimaginable weight of the empire was gently placed upon his capable shoulders. There were no triumphant parades or deafening celebrations to mark his ascension, only a series of quiet, deeply solemn ceremonies where ancient oaths were murmured and the heavy purple robes of state were carefully arranged. As he stood before the quiet assembly of the Senate, the room filled with the soft rustling of woolen togas and the serious faces of Rome's oldest families, Marcus did not look like a man who had finally achieved his greatest ambition. Instead, he looked like a weary but profoundly dedicated guardian, accepting a heavy, lifelong burden with a steady and humble heart. It was in this quiet moment of supreme authority that Marcus made a decision that gently but forever altered the course of Roman tradition, revealing the true depth of his philosophical soul. Rather than holding the vast and dazzling power of the empire solely in his own hands, he insisted that his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, be elevated to stand quietly beside him as a full and equal co-emperor. To the ancient and traditional senators who watched in hushed surprise, this voluntary sharing of absolute rule was entirely unprecedented, a quiet breaking of the old ways. But Marcus understood, with a slow and measured wisdom, that the sprawling Roman world, stretching from the misty green forests of Britain to the endless, sun-baked sands of Syria, was simply too vast and too complex for one man to hold alone. He recognized that true strength does not lie in the jealous hoarding of authority, but in the graceful willingness to share a heavy load, turning a solitary throne into a quiet partnership built on mutual respect and shared duty. As the new reign slowly settled into its steady, enduring rhythm, the daily life within the grand palace remained almost exactly as it had been, preserving the same peaceful and unassuming routines that Marcus had always deeply cherished. The quiet philosopher had officially become the supreme emperor, but the heavy gold of the crown did not in any way alter the gentle nature of the man who wore it. He continued to dress in simple, unadorned wool. He treated his household staff and the most powerful senators with the exact same level of measured, enduring respect, and he maintained his lifelong habit of rising long before the pale morning sun to sit entirely alone in the hushed stillness of his private rooms. He found a profound comfort in the soft scratching of his stylus on parchment, anchoring his mind before the heavy demands of the day began to unfold, while the millions of citizens across the vast, sprawling empire went peacefully about their lives, feeling perfectly secure under the watchful, dedicated care of their new ruler. Marcus simply went back to work. He spent his long, quiet days reading the countless dusty scrolls of state, listening patiently to complicated legal disputes, and managing the endless affairs of the world with a slow, deliberate care that left no detail overlooked. The thoughtful young boy who had once hoped only for a secluded life of quiet study had finally stepped into the very center of human history, arriving at the absolute summit of worldly power, not with a conqueror's loud and restless cry, but with the quiet, endlessly reassuring presence of a man entirely devoted to the unglamorous work of serving others. As the quiet reality of his new position slowly settled over him, Marcus Aurelius soon discovered that the vast, sprawling empire he now ruled was not entirely at rest. Far beyond the thick, protective marble walls of the imperial palace, far beyond the peaceful, shaded courtyard gardens and the familiar winding streets of Rome, the boundaries of the known world were beginning to subtly shift. Word gradually arrived from the distant eastern frontiers that the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival, had moved into the province of Armenia, threatening the peaceful stability of Syria. Yet, in the heart of the capital, these deeply concerning reports did not arrive with the sudden harsh blast of warning horns or panicked shouts in the public squares. Instead, they arrived softly, carried by exhausted messengers traveling along the ancient stone roads, bringing heavy scrolls bound with thick leather cords and stamped with cracked, deep red wax seals. For a man who so deeply loved peace and philosophical contemplation, the arrival of these distant conflicts was a heavy burden, a quiet reminder that the world beyond his windows was unpredictable and often unforgiving. In response to this distant unrest, Marcus made a careful, measured decision that perfectly reflected his collaborative approach to leadership. He gently dispatched his adoptive brother and co-emperor, Lucius Verus, to take personal command of the Eastern campaign, trusting him to directly manage the military affairs. For the next several years, stretching continuously from the year 161 to 166, the massive Roman world was effectively and quietly governed by this unique shared partnership. While Lucius traveled toward the warm, sun-baked landscapes of the East, Marcus willingly took on the immense unseen burden of managing the sprawling logistics of the empire from the quiet, structured center of Rome. He did not seek the dramatic, sweeping glory of military command, nor did he desire the loud, echoing adulation of a conquering hero. His war was an entirely different kind of endeavor. It was a slow, deliberate practice of endless administrative care, built upon a foundation of steady patience and written correspondence. Picture the hushed, dimly lit council rooms of the imperial palace on a cool, quiet evening, where the only sound to be heard was the soft, rhythmic tapping of rain falling gently against the clay tile roofs. Inside these warm, enclosed spaces, large canvas maps were carefully unrolled across smooth wooden tables, their curling corners held down securely by polished brass weights. Marcus spent countless hours standing over these maps, far removed from the dust, the noise, and the chaos of the distant battlefields. He managed the slow, steady flow of essential supplies, ensuring that heavy wooden ships laden with grain sailed safely across the deep blue waters of the Mediterranean, and that the incredibly complex needs of a distant, moving army were met with reliable, unwavering precision. He was the quiet, necessary anchor, holding the massive weight of the Roman state steady, balancing the immense cost of the Eastern campaigns with the everyday domestic needs of the millions of ordinary citizens who relied upon his careful judgment. It is a profound and heavy thing to hold the lives of thousands in your hands, to make decisions in a quiet, isolated room that will eventually ripple outward to affect people you will never meet. Yet Marcus bore this emotional burden with the exact same gentle, uncomplaining grace that he applied to his daily philosophical studies. While the vast, sprawling city of Rome slept peacefully around him, its citizens resting comfortably under the protective, watchful care of their emperor, Marcus was often the very last one awake. In the deep, settling stillness of the night, with the faint, dry scent of ink and melting wax lingering in the cool air, he would sit alone at his desk and write. He composed endless streams of letters to Lucius, to his distant generals, and to the provincial governors, his soft-spoken authority traveling across hundreds of miles of ancient roads to hold the empire together. Eventually, the Eastern campaigns drew to a close, with Lucius Verus and the Roman legions achieving a successful resolution to the conflict, restoring the borders and bringing a temporary calm back to the region. But for Marcus, seated quietly in his study, as the pale morning light began to wash over the sleeping hills of Rome, the true victory was not found in the defeat of an enemy. It was found in the steady, unbroken maintenance of his own internal balance, in his ability to meet the heavy demands of the world without losing his gentle nature. He had managed the vast empire beyond his windows simply by remaining perfectly centered within himself, proving that true strength is not always found in the loud clash of distant swords, but in the quiet, persistent dedication to a life of duty, executed patiently, day after softly unfolding day. In the gentle wake of the Eastern campaigns, as the Roman legions began their long, slow journey back toward the familiar hills of home, they unknowingly carried with them a quiet and devastating shadow. The year 166 brought the arrival of a sweeping illness, an invisible tide that slowly washed over the vast expanse of the empire, eventually reaching the very heart of the capital itself. This was the Antonine Plague, a profound and sorrowful season that would test the endurance of the Roman world like never before. As the illness spread softly but relentlessly along the ancient, sun-baked stone roads, the once bustling and noisy streets of the great city gradually fell into a heavy, unnatural silence. The vibrant marketplaces, usually overflowing with the bright colors of imported silk and the rich scents of foreign spices, stood entirely empty. The great marble temples were quiet, and the heavy wooden doors of the tightly packed homes were drawn firmly shut to keep out the uncertain air. The continuous, comforting hum of Roman life was slowly replaced by the hushed footsteps of physicians moving carefully from door to door, and the soft, distant tolling of bells marking the slow passage of the days. For an emperor who felt the weight of his people's lives as deeply as a father feels for his children, this period was an agonizing trial of the heart. Yet true to the calm and steady nature he had carefully cultivated since childhood, Marcus did not allow himself to be swept away by panic, nor did he seek the safe, isolated refuge of a distant country estate. While many who possessed the wealth and means quietly fled the crowded city for the clearer, cooler air of the countryside, Marcus chose to remain entirely visible and accessible in the center of Rome. He understood that in times of great and sweeping uncertainty, people do not merely need distant administrative solutions. They need the reassuring presence of a leader who is willing to share in their vulnerability. He opened the imperial granaries to ensure that the frightened and isolated citizens would not go hungry. He quietly funded the arrival of healers from across the Mediterranean, and he emptied his own personal treasuries to help families respectfully lay their loved ones to rest with the quiet dignity they deserved. But beyond the endless practical duties of managing this unprecedented crisis, the long shadow of the illness presented Marcus with the most profound philosophical challenge of his entire life. How does a man who believes in a rational, gently ordered universe make sense of such widespread and seemingly arbitrary sorrow? In the quiet, lonely hours of the night, sitting by the familiar, flickering light of his oil lamp, he wrestled softly with these heavy questions. His Stoic teachers had always taught him that we cannot control the unpredictable winds of fortune or the delicate fragility of the human body. But watching the quiet suffering of his people pushed this abstract philosophy to its very limits. Yet rather than surrendering to bitterness or despair, Marcus leaned even deeper into his practice. He gently reminded himself that while he could not command the illness to simply vanish, he could absolutely control his own capacity for boundless compassion, choosing to remain a steady, unbreakable pillar for those who had nothing else to lean upon. Through these incredibly dark and quiet years, the philosopher emperor became a living embodiment of patient endurance. He moved through the hushed and shadowed corridors of the palace with a slow, deliberate grace, making the difficult decisions required to keep the vast machinery of the empire slowly turning, even as the world around him seemed to be pausing for a long, heavy breath. He learned to gracefully accept the profound limits of his own immense power, understanding with a softening humility that an emperor can build massive walls of stone and command endless legions, but he can never legislate the forces of nature. He simply did the next right thing, day after exhausting day, meeting the deep sorrow of his era with a gentle, unwavering kindness. And as the long nights stretched into quiet, hesitant mornings, his steady presence became a small, comforting light in the darkness, a quiet reminder to his people that even the longest and most difficult winters eventually give way to the warming sun. As the long shadow of the plague slowly began to lift from the heart of the empire, Marcus Aurelius found himself drawn far away from the warm, familiar marble halls of Rome. The vast and complex world he governed was shifting once again, this time along the distant, sprawling edges of the northern frontier. In the year 170, the emperor left behind the comfortable, sunlit courtyards of his youth and traveled toward the vast, misty expanse of the Danube River, where a coalition of Germanic tribes was beginning to press against the boundaries of the Roman world. The contrast between the capital he had left behind and the landscape he now entered could not have been more profound. Here, there were no heated baths, no grand libraries smelling of dry parchment and cedar, and no soft linen draped across comfortable beds. Instead, the world was painted in the muted, quiet tones of winter. The air was sharp and cold, the ground was often thick with mud or hardened by frost, and a heavy, damp fog frequently settled over the dark green forests and the slow, icy waters of the great river. For the next decade of his life, this vast, open, and unforgiving landscape would become his home, transforming the philosopher emperor into a weary but deeply enduring guardian of the boundaries of civilization. Life along the northern frontier moved with a slow, grinding rhythm, dictated not by the artificial schedules of the Senate or the palace, but by the turning of the harsh seasons and the basic necessities of survival. Picture the sprawling military camps as evening slowly falls, the pale winter sun dipping below the tree line and leaving behind a sky of deep, bruised purple. Thousands of heavy canvas tents are pitched across the frozen ground, and the soft orange glow of countless campfires begins to dot the landscape, offering a small, fragile warmth against the encroaching night. You can almost hear the soft, rhythmic stomping of distant horses trying to keep warm, the muffled clinking of metal armor, and the quiet crackle of frost forming on heavy leather straps. Marcus, now an older man whose hair and beard were beginning to turn silver, lived right in the center of this difficult world. He did not ask for a grand pavilion or special luxuries to insulate himself from the cold. He wore the same thick, rough wool cloaks as his men, ate the same simple, hearty rations, and felt the exact same biting wind against his face. By choosing to share their hardships, he quietly earned the deep, unwavering devotion of the veteran soldiers, who found a profound comfort in seeing their emperor walking slowly among the tents, his presence a steady and reassuring anchor in a freezing, uncertain world. The conflicts on this frontier were not resolved in swift, glorious victories, but through years of patient, unglamorous endurance. Marcus approached the massive task of defending the empire not with the loud, aggressive ambition of a conqueror, but with the careful, protective sorrow of a father trying to secure his home. He spent his days in quiet, strategic conferences, studying detailed maps spread across rough wooden tables, and negotiating with tribal chieftains with the same respectful, measured diplomacy he used in the capital. He recognized the shared humanity even in those who stood against Rome, understanding that the tribes moving across the frozen rivers were often simply desperate families seeking safety and warmth in a changing world. Through the long, isolating winters, when the heavy snows made movement impossible and the entire frontier seemed to hold its breath under a blanket of white, Marcus learned to gracefully accept the extreme limits of his own physical endurance. His body, never particularly robust and now weary from years of relentless duty, often ached with the cold, yet he never complained, finding a strange, leveling peace in the simple shared struggle of remaining warm and waiting patiently for the distant arrival of spring. It was here, in the vast, quiet emptiness of the north, that Marcus's inner life reached its most profound depths. When the military councils finally ended and the camp settled into the hushed stillness of the night, the emperor would retreat to the small, enclosed space of his personal tent. In the lonely, flickering light of a single oil lamp, with the sound of the freezing wind brushing softly against the heavy canvas walls, he would sit alone at a simple wooden writing table. Far from the watchful eyes of the court, far from the endless demands of the public, he was simply a solitary man wrapped in a heavy cloak, seeking comfort in the slow, familiar rhythm of his own thoughts. The physical world around him was incredibly harsh and demanding, yet inside his mind, he cultivated a space of absolute, undisturbed tranquility. He realized that true philosophy is not something learned in the comfort of a quiet garden, but something deeply lived and relied upon when the world is dark and the air is painfully cold. And as he picked up his stylus to write, the quiet scratching of metal on parchment became the only sound in the tent, anchoring him safely as the vast sleeping empire rested heavily upon his tired shoulders. As the deep winter night settled heavily over the frozen landscape of the northern frontier, the sprawling military camps gradually fell into a profound and comforting silence. The daily noise of marching boots, the clinking of armor, and the sharp commands of the officers softly faded away, replaced only by the gentle, rhythmic sound of the wind brushing against the thick canvas of the imperial tent. Inside, wrapped warmly in a heavy woolen cloak to ward off the biting chill, the aging emperor sat entirely alone. By the soft, flickering light of a single oil lamp, Marcus Aurelius leaned over a simple wooden folding table, a smooth wax tablet and a stylus resting quietly in his weathered hands. This was his sacred time, the few fleeting hours of absolute stillness before the dawn, when the crushing weight of the Roman Empire was temporarily set aside, allowing him to simply be a man alone with his own thoughts. He did not write in Latin, the formal, rigid language of military commands, imperial decrees, and Senate declarations. Instead, he chose to write in Greek, the flowing, expressive language of his childhood tutors and the ancient philosophers who had shaped his mind so many years ago. He was not drafting a book for the public, nor was he composing a grand philosophical treatise meant to secure his legacy among future historians. These writings, which the world would eventually come to know as the Meditations, were simply private letters addressed only to his own soul. They were quiet, necessary attempts to maintain his inner balance, gentle reminders scrawled in the lonely hours of the night to help him remain kind, patient, and resilient when the sun inevitably rose and the heavy demands of his position returned. As the small flame cast dancing golden shadows across the canvas walls, Marcus wrote slowly and deliberately about the fleeting nature of human existence. He reminded himself, with a softening acceptance, that life is beautifully temporary, comparing the generations of humanity to leaves on a tree, blossoming quietly in the spring, only to be scattered by the autumn wind. He found a strange, profound comfort in this impermanence, realizing that all the anxieties, the political rivalries, and the heavy burdens of his office were merely passing shadows in the vast, endless river of time. By accepting his own mortality without fear, he freed himself from the heavy, suffocating anxiety of trying to control the unpredictable world, finding instead a peaceful sanctuary in the simple present moment. He also wrote about his fellow human beings, continually reminding himself to meet the flaws and difficult behaviors of others not with anger or imperial judgment, but with a deep, unwavering compassion. He wrote that we are all born to work together, like the upper and lower rows of teeth, bound by a shared universal brotherhood. When he felt exhausted by endless administrative disputes or let down by the frailty of his allies, he used his stylus to gently guide his own heart back toward forgiveness, practicing the quiet, empathetic discipline of seeing the hidden human struggles behind the actions of others. He taught himself, through slow and deliberate repetition, that true strength was never found in the harsh domination of a conquered enemy or the loud assertion of authority, but in the absolute, unshakable mastery of his own inner response. And so, night after quiet night, the philosopher emperor continued to write, building a peaceful, invisible fortress within himself that no winter storm or barbarian army could ever breach. The words flowed softly onto the parchment, serving as a comforting anchor while the vast world spun endlessly around him. As the oil lamp gradually burned down, signaling the slow approach of the gray morning light, Marcus would carefully close his journal, his mind clear, his spirit gently restored, and his heart prepared to face whatever the new day might bring, carrying his deeply earned peace back out into the waking world. As the long years of the northern campaign stretched slowly onward, the heavy, relentless demands of the frontier began to leave their visible marks upon the aging emperor. The youthful philosopher who had once walked the sunlit marble halls of Rome had gradually transformed into a weary, silver-haired guardian, his once sturdy frame now growing gaunt beneath the thick, travel-worn wool of his winter cloaks. The biting cold and the endless administrative burdens had brought with them chronic illnesses, becoming a quiet, constant ache that he simply accepted as another natural condition of his life, choosing to endure the discomfort without complaint as he went about his daily duties. The seasons turned with a slow, heavy rhythm, bringing gray skies and falling leaves, mirroring the autumnal season of his own life. This period of his reign was also marked by the profound and gathering shadows of personal loss. Over the passing years, he had endured the deep sorrow of burying many of his children, and he had mourned the passing of his adoptive brother and co-emperor, Lucius Verus. Eventually, he also faced the quiet, devastating absence of his beloved wife and companion, Faustina, leaving him increasingly alone at the absolute summit of worldly power. Yet he met each of these heavy, heartbreaking losses not with angry despair, but with a softening, melancholy grace. He folded away the letters bearing sad news with a slow, deliberate care, reminding himself by the dim light of his evening lamp that everything we love is only a temporary gift, eventually returning to the vast, peaceful current of nature from which it came. As his physical strength continued to slowly ebb, his thoughts naturally turned toward the distant future of the empire and to his surviving son, Commodus, who was brought to the northern camps to learn the heavy art of leadership. The young man was very different from his father, having been raised entirely within the sheltered, flattering luxury of the imperial port. While Marcus sought the quiet corners of the camp to read and reflect, Commodus was drawn to the loud, dazzling ceremonies of power, finding joy in the bright armor and the cheering crowds, rather than the quiet, unglamorous work of administration. For a father who had spent his entire life cultivating inner virtue and restraint, this difference in character was a quiet, enduring sorrow. Marcus tried patiently to guide his son, to show him the heavy responsibilities that accompanied the purple robes, but he slowly began to realize that true wisdom cannot simply be handed down like a crown or a piece of land. True to his lifelong philosophical practice, Marcus gracefully accepted the profound limits of his own influence, He understood that he could not control the choices his son would eventually make, nor could he permanently secure the vast, unpredictable future of the Roman world. He could only do his own part, acting with justice and kindness in the present moment and allowing the rest to unfold exactly as it must. Like a weary traveler watching the evening shadows stretch across a quiet valley, the aging emperor felt the long, demanding day of his life slowly drawing to a close, finding a deep and settling comfort in the knowledge that his own work was finally nearing its end. In the early spring of the year 180, as the harsh winter began to slowly loosen its grip on the northern frontier, the long and exhausting journey of Marcus Aurelius finally drew to a gentle close. He had spent his final days in the military camp at Vindobona, far away from the warm, familiar marble halls of Rome, surrounded by the loyal soldiers who had come to revere him, not just as their supreme commander, but as a deeply protective and enduring father figure. There was no fear or restless struggle in his final moments, only the quiet, softening acceptance of a philosopher who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this natural and peaceful transition. As his physical strength quietly slipped away, he faced the end with the same profound and measured dignity that had characterized his entire reign, slipping softly into a deep and final rest, as peacefully as a candle burning down to its very last drop of wax in the hushed stillness of a darkened room. The vast and powerful Roman Empire he left behind would eventually fracture and fade into the shifting sands of history, its grand temples slowly crumbling into dust, and its once invincible legions becoming nothing more than distant echoes in the long turning pages of time. Yet the true legacy of this remarkable man did not survive in the form of conquered territories, heavy gold coins, or massive stone monuments reaching toward the sky. Instead, his memory endured through the fragile, deeply personal pages of a private journal that was never meant to be read by anyone other than himself. These quiet reflections, written by the soft, flickering light of a solitary oil lamp on the freezing, muddy edges of civilization, would miraculously survive the collapse of the ancient world. His words passed softly from hand to hand across the centuries, becoming a lasting sanctuary for countless people seeking comfort, balance, and meaning in an unpredictable world. He is remembered today as a man who held the absolute highest authority on earth, yet kept returning to the quiet, unglamorous work of governing his own soul, leaving behind a profound reminder that true strength is always found in gentle endurance and unwavering compassion. And so, as the ancient lamps grow dim, Marcus Aurelius remains with us not as a distant emperor, but as a quiet voice in the night, reminding us to rest gently inside the life we have been given.